In Portland's affluent Laurelhurst neighborhood, a quiet tech executive was about to unleash 3 years of calculated patience. What started as a supportive girlfriend role took a shocking turn when her younger boyfriend dismissed her as old and useless. Maxine Reynolds wasn't your typical middle-aged woman. For decades, she had spent her life building a real estate empire, known for her strategic mind and hidden wealth. When Derek called her worthless during their argument, he had no idea he was standing in her house. Max's silence, that would lead to his complete destruction. What began as relationship advice would become devastating revelation. The renovation community would never be the same after learning who really owned his masterpiece. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The chandelier cast warm light across the polished mahogany dining table. As Derek Morrison raised his wine glass, his smile practiced and confident. To the future of Morrison Renovations, he announced to the 8 investors gathered in what he called his masterpiece, a fully restored 1890s Victorian mansion in Portland's exclusive Laurelhurst neighborhood. Max Reynolds lifted her glass with the others, watching Derek's performance with the detached fascination of someone observing a play she'd seen too many times. He moved through the room like he owned it, which, in his mind, he did. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was applauding improvements made to her own property. As you can see, Derek continued, gesturing toward the crown molding he'd spent 6 months perfecting. Attention to detail is what sets us apart. Every original fixture has been restored to period specifications while incorporating modern luxury amenities. Investor Patricia Hamlin, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, nodded approvingly. The craftsmanship is exceptional, Derek. This house must represent a significant personal investment. Everything I have, Derek replied, his voice carrying just the right note of passionate conviction. When you believe in something completely, you put your whole life behind it. Max studied the faces around the table. Tech executives, real estate developers, old Portland money looking for their next venture. They saw Derek's boyish enthusiasm, his genuine love for restoration work, his infectious confidence about the future. They didn't see the 3 separate loan applications he'd submitted in the past month, or the way he paced the floors at night when he thought she was sleeping. Maxine works in tech, Derek said, drawing her into the conversation with practiced ease. She understands the importance of solid infrastructure and long-term vision. Actually, it's Max, she corrected gently, offering the smile she'd perfected over years of business meetings. And Derek's absolutely right about the vision, though sometimes I wonder if we might benefit from a more measured approach to expansion. The suggestion hung in the air for a moment. Derek's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on his wine glass. Max is naturally cautious, he said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. It's adorable, really. But in this business, you have to be willing to take calculated risks. There it was, the subtle dismissal wrapped in affection. The way he positioned her concerns as endearing rather than valid. Max had learned to recognize these moments, the small ways Derek diminished her input while maintaining plausible deniability. The evening progressed smoothly. Derek showcased the restored hardwood floors, the period-appropriate lighting fixtures, the kitchen that seamlessly blended 1890s charm with 21st century functionality. Max played her role perfectly, the supportive girlfriend who asked just enough questions to seem engaged without stealing focus from Derek's presentation. But in the quiet spaces between conversations, she found herself cataloging details differently than the investors. The Italian marble countertops she'd specifically requested when she bought the property 4 years ago, the custom millwork that had cost her $40,000, the restored stained glass windows that had required specialists from San Francisco. Every beautiful detail Derek presented as his vision had been part of her original plans, carefully documented in the renovation proposal she'd approved through her shell company, Cascade Holdings, LLC. Derek believed he'd discovered this property, fought for it, won it through determination and charm. He had no idea that Max had purchased it 6 months before they met, or that his landlord was a company she'd created specifically to keep her real estate investments private. By 10:30, the investors had left with promises to review Derek's expansion proposal. He was riding high on their enthusiasm, his earlier tension forgotten, as he poured himself another glass of wine and settled onto the restored Victorian sofa. "I think Hamlin's definitely in," he said, loosening his tie. "Did you see how she kept taking pictures? And Thompson's already texting me about timeline details." Max curled into the leather armchair across from him, noting how Derek sprawled across the sofa with the unconscious entitlement of someone who believed the space belonged to him. "They seemed impressed," she agreed. "Though I still think you might want to consider starting with one additional property instead of 3. Derek's expression shifted, the contentment draining from his features. "We've been through this, Max. Small thinking gets you small results. I didn't restore this place by playing it safe. I'm not suggesting you play it safe. I'm suggesting you build sustainable growth instead of what?" Derek's voice carried a sharp edge now. "Instead of having ambition? Instead of thinking bigger than a middle management mindset?" The words stung because they were designed to. Derek had a talent for finding precisely the right insult to land maximum damage, while maintaining enough ambiguity to deny intent later. Max felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the sensation of being simultaneously seen and completely misunderstood. "I'm thinking about cash flow and market timing," she said evenly. "About building something that lasts instead of something that looks impressive on paper." Derek stood abruptly, pacing to the bay window that overlooked the garden. "You know what I think this is really about?" He turned back to face her, his expression mixing frustration with something crueler. "I think you're threatened by my success. You've been coasting in your little tech job for years, watching other people build empires, and now you can't handle watching someone you're supposed to support actually achieving something significant." Max felt her breath catch. The accusation was so far from reality it was almost laughable, except Derek's tone made it clear he wasn't joking. "That's not. You're 40 years old, Max," Derek continued, his voice gaining momentum. "You should be encouraging ambition, not trying to tear it down because you're insecure about your own lack of achievement. But instead, you're acting old and useless, clinging to outdated thinking because you're too scared to embrace what real success looks like." The words hit like physical blows, old and useless. At 40, from a man who was living in her house, planning his future with her money, building his dreams on her foundation, while lecturing her about success. Max sat perfectly still, her face betraying nothing of the calculation suddenly racing through her mind. Derek was still talking, something about traditional gender roles and support systems, but she wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about the power he believed he held, and the power he had no idea she possessed. "You're right," she said quietly, interrupting his monologue. "I have been thinking small." Derek's expression shifted to surprise, then satisfaction. "I'm glad you can see that. We're building something important here, and I need you to trust the process." Max stood, smoothing her dress with movements that appeared calm, but masked the cold fury building beneath her composed exterior. "I do trust the process, Derek. I trust it completely." He smiled, mistaking her tone for capitulation. "Good, because what we're building here is going to change everything." "Yes," Max agreed, her voice carrying a certainty that Derek interpreted as renewed faith in his vision. "It absolutely is." As Derek headed upstairs, already moving on to other concerns, Max remained in the living room she'd designed, surrounded by the restoration she'd funded, considering the lesson she was about to teach about the difference between appearing powerful and actually being powerful. The game was about to begin, and Derek had no idea he was already 3 moves behind. The morning fog lifted slowly from the Willamette River as Max walked through Laurelhurst Park, her phone pressed to her ear. Sleep had been elusive after Derek's cutting words, and she'd risen before dawn with a clarity that felt dangerous. "Sophie, I need to see you," Max said when her best friend answered. "Can you meet me for coffee?" "You sound terrible." "Give me 20 minutes. The coffee shop on Hawthorne buzzed with morning energy as Max slid into the booth across from Sophie Martinez. Her best friend looked every inch the successful divorce attorney. Sharp blazer, perfectly styled hair, eyes that missed nothing. "You look like you haven't slept," Sophie observed, signaling the waitress. What did Derek do now? Max stared at her cup, watching steam rise in delicate spirals. He called me old and useless. Sophie's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. He said what? Last night, after his investor dinner, I suggested a more measured approach to expansion, and he told me I was thinking small because I'm 40 and insecure about my lack of achievement. Max's voice remained steady, but Sophie caught the tremor beneath the control. That son of a bitch. Sophie's voice carried cold fury. Max, you built a tech company from nothing. You have more real estate holdings than most investment firms. Which he doesn't know. By design. Sophie leaned back, studying her friend's face. Where exactly is your head right now? Because I know that look, and it usually means someone's about to learn a very expensive lesson. Max traced patterns on the table with her finger. I own 60% of his dream house. The words hung in the air like a live wire. Sophie blinked slowly, processing the implications. The Victorian mansion, Max continued quietly. The one he calls his masterpiece. I bought it 4 years ago through Cascade Holdings, 6 months before we met. He's been renovating my property this entire time. Jesus Christ, Max. Sophie's voice was barely above a whisper. What were you planning to do with that information? Originally, nothing. I thought it was romantic, a secret I'd tell him someday when we were solid enough that it wouldn't matter. Max's smile held no warmth. Now I think Derek needs to understand exactly how powerless he actually is. Sophie set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. I've spent 15 years watching marriages destroy themselves over financial deception. What you're describing isn't justice, it's revenge. Maybe revenge is what he's earned. Maybe it is, Sophie agreed. But what about what you've earned? You've spent 3 years building a relationship with someone you've been fundamentally dishonest with. You want to punish Derek for not respecting you, but how can he respect someone he doesn't actually know? The question hit harder than Derek's insults had. Max felt familiar, defensive walls rising, the ones that had protected her through years of being pursued for her money rather than herself. I was protecting myself. You know what happened with Richard. Richard was a gold digger who saw your success as his meal ticket, Sophie said firmly. But Derek doesn't even know about your success. How can you judge his character based on information he doesn't have? Max's phone buzzed with a text from her brother Jimmy. Need to talk. Your boy Derek's been asking questions about property financing. Call me. I have to go, Max said, standing abruptly. Jimmy needs to see me. Sophie caught her arm gently. Max, promise me you'll think about this. Really think about it. Not just about what Derek deserves, but about what kind of person you want to be when this is over. The drive to Jimmy's office gave Max time to consider Sophie's words, but they kept getting tangled up with Derek's voice echoing in her memory. Old and useless. The phrase had burrowed deep, awakening every insecurity she'd thought she'd conquered. James Reynolds looked up as Max entered his Pearl District office, his expression mixing brotherly concern with professional worry. At 45, Jimmy had inherited their father's steady temperament and their mother's gift for seeing through facades. Derek called this morning, Jimmy said without preamble. He's asking about commercial property loans, specifically about leveraging residential real estate as collateral. Max settled into the chair across from his desk. The Victorian? Has to be. Property worth $2.8 million. Recently renovated. Prime location. Says he's the primary owner but needs to understand the process for accessing equity. Primary owner, Max repeated. Interesting choice of words. Jimmy studied his sister's face. Max, I've been managing your properties for 8 years. I helped you create Cascade Holdings specifically to keep your investments private. But this situation feels different. More complicated. How so? Because you're not just an investor anymore. You're his girlfriend, sharing his life, making plans together. And he has no idea that his entire foundation belongs to you. Max felt the weight of accumulated deceptions settling around her shoulders. I was going to tell him eventually. When? The question hung in the air because Max didn't have an answer. He called me old and useless last night, she said finally. Jimmy's expression darkened. That changes things. What are the legal implications if I reveal the ownership? Jimmy pulled up files on his computer. Legally, you're clear. Cascade Holdings owns the property free and clear. Derek's lease allows renovations with approval, which we've been giving. He's improved your investment significantly. And if I choose to end the lease? 60 days notice, standard terms. But it would destroy him financially. His entire business model is built around that property. His reputation, client relationships, expansion plans. Everything depends on the Victorian as his flagship project. Max felt the power of her position settling into her bones like winter cold. Derek had spent years building his identity around being self-made, the visionary who'd rescued a historic property. The truth would shatter that narrative completely. There's something else, Jimmy continued. Derek's making inquiries about second mortgages, equity lines. He's planning to leverage the property for expansion. If he moves forward with those applications, he'd be committing fraud, Max finished. You can't mortgage property you don't own. Exactly. And if he's caught, it won't just be embarrassing, it could be criminal. The implications crystallized in Max's mind. Derek was walking toward a cliff, and she was the only one who could see the edge. She could warn him, save him from his own ambitions, or she could step back and watch him fall. Her phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Talked to Jimmy this morning about financing options. Your brother's really sharp. Lucky to have him in our corner. Our corner. As if Jimmy were Derek's ally rather than Max's brother and business partner. As if the property Derek was planning to mortgage belonged to both of them. What would you do? Max asked. Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. I'd ask myself what I hope to accomplish. If it's justice, there might be better ways. If it's revenge... He shrugged. Revenge has a way of costing more than you expect to pay. Max left Jimmy's office with more questions than answers, but one thing had become clear. Derek was about to make a move that would force her hand. She could continue the deception and become complicit in his fraud, or she could reveal the truth and watch his world collapse. Either way, their perfect facade was about to crumble. The only question was whether she'd be standing in the rubble or watching from a safe distance when it fell. Derek stared at his laptop screen in the Morrison Renovations office, reading the same loan rejection email for the third time. The language was polite but final. Current market conditions require more stringent lending criteria for investment property financing. This was the fourth rejection in 2 weeks. Derek's instincts told him something else was happening. This felt targeted. Marcus Webb looked up from construction plans spread across the drafting table. At 52, Marcus had learned to read trouble long before it became obvious. Another rejection, Marcus observed, his voice neutral. Derek closed the laptop harder than necessary. Same bullshit excuses, risk assessment, market volatility. Marcus had built and lost a construction empire once before. The warning signs felt familiar. Derek, maybe we should talk about the foundation of this expansion. What do you mean? The Victorian. Your ownership stake, the actual legal structure. Marcus kept his tone conversational. When I lost my business in 2008, it was because I'd built everything on assumptions instead of verified facts. Derek's jaw tightened. The Victorian is solid. I've put everything into that property. But the actual ownership papers are handled through my property management company, Derek interrupted. Everything's legitimate, documented. Marcus nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he'd heard similar assurances before. When Hamlin's group starts due diligence, they'll want title documents, property valuations, equity statements. The words hit Derek like cold water. In his enthusiasm about expansion, he'd focused on vision rather than paperwork. His arrangement had always been handled through Elena Vasquez. I can get you all of that, Derek said, but uncertainty crept into his voice. Meanwhile, across town, Max was implementing a strategy Derek couldn't have imagined. Her coffee meeting with Patricia Hamlin was ostensibly about tech networking, but conversation quickly turned to investment opportunities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Your boyfriend seems passionate about restoration work, Patricia observed, though his expansion timeline feels aggressive for someone working with a single property. Max stirred her coffee thoughtfully. Derek's always been ambitious. Sometimes I wonder if he's moving faster than his foundation can support. Foundation? Financial foundation. He's leveraged everything on the Victorian project. If that property were to become unavailable for any reason, his entire business model would collapse. Patricia's eyes sharpened. Unavailable how? Any number of ways. Property ownership disputes, financing complications. Historic properties can be complicated. Max's tone remained conversational, but she was planting seeds of doubt with surgical precision. By the time they parted, Patricia was asking herself questions she hadn't considered before. That afternoon, Elena Vasquez sat in her real estate office, staring at files that had become increasingly uncomfortable to handle. Derek's inquiries about second mortgages and equity loans were escalating. Her phone rang. Max's number. Elena, I was hoping we could chat about the Victorian property. Elena's pulse quickened. What can I help you with? I think it's time Derek and I had a conversation about the actual ownership structure. I'm concerned he might be making financial plans based on incomplete information. Elena had known this day would come. She'd watched Derek pour his heart into renovating a property he believed he owned, while the actual owner sat quietly at his dinner table. Max, I think that conversation is overdue, Elena said carefully. Derek's been asking about leveraging the property. Questions I can't answer honestly without revealing information that isn't mine to reveal. What kind of questions? Second mortgage applications. Equity lines of credit. He wants to use the Victorian as collateral for expansion. Max felt a chill. Derek wasn't just operating under false assumptions. He was about to commit fraud. Elena, I need you to stall any applications he submits. Don't approve anything. For how long? Until I decide how to handle this. That evening, Derek returned to the Victorian with frustration weighing on his shoulders. Max was in the kitchen, preparing dinner with meditative movements. How was your day? She asked. Challenging, Derek admitted. Banks are being difficult about expansion financing. Maybe that's the universe telling you to slow down, Max suggested gently. Derek's expression darkened. I can't believe you're still pushing that narrative. Playing it safe gets you nowhere. I'm talking about building on solid ground instead of assumptions. What's that supposed to mean? Max turned to face him, studying his face with intensity that made Derek uncomfortable. Making sure you actually own what you think you own. Something in her tone triggered Derek's defensive instincts. Are you questioning my competence? I know exactly what I own. Do you? The question hung in the air with unexpected weight. Derek stared at Max, uncertain whether they were talking about general principles or something specific. What are you implying? She turned back to the stove. I'm suggesting that successful people verify their assumptions before making major commitments. Derek felt anger building. You know what I think this is about? You're threatened by my success. You're trying to undermine my confidence because you can't stand watching someone younger actually achieve something significant. The words were designed to hurt, but instead of the defensive response he expected, Max simply nodded. That's an interesting theory, she said quietly. Tell me more about what you think you've achieved. Derek's anger gained momentum. I've taken a property that was falling apart and turned it into something magnificent. I've built a business, established investor relationships. I've accomplished more in 3 years than most people manage in a decade. And you did all of this? How exactly? Through hard work, vision, and courage to take risks that people like you would never understand. Max set down her wooden spoon, turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes made Derek suddenly uncertain. "People like me," she repeated. "What kind of person do you think I am, Derek?" The question felt like a trap, but Derek was too angry to back down. "You're someone who's spent so long playing it safe that you've forgotten what real ambition looks like. You're 40 with a middle management job and no significant achievements." The words echoed in the kitchen, bouncing off custom millwork and marble countertops that Derek believed represented his vision. Max stood perfectly still, absorbing each insult. "I see," she said finally. "And this property? You're absolutely certain it belongs to you?" "Of course it belongs to me. Every decision, every detail reflects my vision and investment." Max nodded slowly. "Then you won't mind showing me the ownership documents. The actual title papers proving this property is yours." Derek felt his certainty waver. "Why would you need to see those?" "Because I want to understand exactly how you managed to acquire and renovate a property worth nearly $3 million on a contractor's income." The question exposed a gap Derek had never examined. The actual mechanics of acquisition had been handled through Elena. "Those documents are with my realtor," he said. "Of course they are," Max agreed. "But surely you have copies of something this important." Derek felt ground shifting beneath him. "Max, what's this really about?" She smiled then, an expression that held no warmth, but carried weight of knowledge. "This is about you teaching me what real achievement looks like," Max said quietly. "I'm just trying to understand the foundation you've built your success on." Derek stared at her, suddenly aware that this conversation had moved far beyond their usual arguments. Max's questions felt surgical, designed to expose something he'd never thought to examine. But what? Rachel Morrison pulled her BMW into the Victorian's driveway, her law school training automatically cataloging details others would miss. The property was stunning, but Derek's casual references to his house had triggered her professional skepticism. At 29, Rachel had inherited the Morrison family's critical thinking without Derek's need to dominate every conversation. Law school had taught her to question assumptions and recognize when stories had gaps. Derek opened the door before she could knock, his smile bright but edged with stress she hadn't seen since their father's business failed. "Ratch! Perfect timing. Max is making risotto." Rachel embraced her brother, noting the tremor in his hands. "You look tired." "Big things happening," Derek replied. "Expansion plans, investor meetings." The interior was breathtaking, museum-quality restoration. But as Derek launched into his familiar tour, something nagged at Rachel's legal mind. "This must have cost a fortune," she observed. "Worth every penny," Derek said proudly. "Sometimes you have to invest everything." Rachel wondered about the mathematics. Derek's business was successful, but not by a $3 million Victorian successful. Max appeared from the kitchen, greeting Rachel with genuine warmth. At 40, Max carried herself with confidence. Derek often mistook for submissiveness, but Rachel's trained eye caught sharp intelligence behind the friendly demeanor. "Derek's been showing off again," Max said affectionately. "It's incredible restoration," Rachel replied. "The period detail is remarkable." "Derek did most of the work himself," Max said. "He has such an eye for authentic detail." Rachel caught something in Max's tone, amused approval that suggested layers beneath the surface. Over dinner, Rachel studied the dynamic between her brother and his girlfriend. Derek dominated conversation, but Max's contributions felt strategically placed. When Derek mentioned expansion plans, Max offered gentle questions that seemed supportive but were actually probing. "Financing must be complicated for projects this scale," Rachel observed. Derek's confidence faltered slightly. "Complex, but manageable. The Victorian provides solid collateral." "Collateral?" Rachel's training made the word trigger follow-up questions. "You're leveraging this property for business loans?" "Standard procedure," Derek replied, but his voice carried a defensive edge Rachel recognized. Max set down her wine glass deliberately. "Derek, have you actually reviewed the collateral documentation? Title papers, ownership structures." "Of course," Derek said quickly, but Rachel caught the hesitation. I'd love to see them, Rachel said casually. I'm curious about real estate transactions. Derek's smile became strained. They're with my property management company. Rachel nodded, filing away information. People who actually owned valuable properties kept ownership documents readily available. Derek's vague references felt like deflection. The evening continued pleasantly, but Rachel noted details that didn't fit Derek's story. The way Max seemed intimately familiar with architectural decisions, Derek claimed as his vision. Small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested a narrative that didn't hold up. After dinner, while Derek took a business call, Rachel found herself alone with Max in the kitchen. This is beautiful work, Rachel said, gesturing toward custom cabinetry. Max smiled, but Rachel caught something complex in her expression. Amazing what you can accomplish when you understand the property's potential. Have you known Derek long? 3 years. We met right around when he started the major renovation work. Rachel processed this timeline, comparing it to Derek's version. According to him, he'd owned the property for several years before meeting Max. It must have been exciting, watching him transform this place. Max's smile became more genuine. Oh, it was in excellent condition when Derek started. Someone had already done extensive structural work, updated major systems. Derek's contributions were more about finishing touches. Rachel felt her internal alarm activating. Derek had always described the property as a massive renovation project he'd rescued from decay. But Max's description suggested something else entirely. Rachel, Max said quietly, can I ask you something as someone with legal training? Of course. If someone were making business decisions based on incomplete information about property ownership, what would be the legal implications? The question was carefully neutral, but Rachel felt the weight behind it. That would depend on circumstances. But generally, misrepresenting property ownership for financial gain could be considered fraud. Max nodded thoughtfully. And if the person genuinely believed their claims? If they weren't intentionally lying but were simply mistaken? Intent matters in legal proceedings, Rachel replied slowly. But ignorance isn't always complete defense, especially in business contexts. Derek returned from his call, mood notably darker. Fucking banks, he muttered. Another loan rejection. Rachel and Max exchanged a glance Derek missed entirely. But Rachel caught the subtle communication, and suddenly understood this conversation wasn't theoretical. Derek, Rachel said carefully, maybe this is a sign you should slow down expansion. Make sure all documentation is in order. My documentation is fine, Derek snapped. The problem is banks being overcautious. But you have reviewed ownership papers recently? Rachel pressed. Derek's expression shifted from irritation to alarm. Why is everyone suddenly obsessing over paperwork? I know what I own. The defensive response told Rachel everything she needed to know. Her brother was operating on assumptions rather than verified facts, and someone in this room knew exactly how dangerous that was. Derek, I'm suggesting that before you risk everything, you verify that your foundation is as solid as you believe. My foundation is rock solid, Derek replied, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Max stood to clear dishes, movements calm and deliberate. Foundation is everything, she agreed quietly. Without it, even the most beautiful structure can collapse. Rachel watched Max's face, seeing something that made her stomach tighten. This wasn't just about Derek's business expansion. This was about something more fundamental and more dangerous. As the evening wound down, Rachel found herself with more questions than answers. But one thing had become clear. Her brother was walking on ground that might not be as solid as he believed, and the person who might know the truth was sitting across the dinner table, watching him with the patience of someone who understood exactly how far he had to fall. The drive home gave Rachel time to process what she'd observed. Derek's defensive responses, Max's carefully chosen words, timeline discrepancies. Individually, none proved anything. Collectively, they painted a disturbing picture. By the time she reached her apartment, Rachel had made a decision. Tomorrow, she would start doing what she'd been trained to do. Research, verify, uncover truth. because whatever game was being played in that beautiful Victorian mansion, her brother was at serious risk of losing more than just business expansion plans. He was at risk of losing everything he believed about himself. Rachel Morrison sat in her downtown apartment at 6 a.m., laptop open and coffee growing cold as she navigated through Multnomah County property records. Her legal training had taught her that the truth always left a paper trail. You just had to know where to look. The search for the Victorian mansion's ownership history took less than an hour. What she found made her stomach drop. Property owner, Cascade Holdings, LLC. Purchase date, March 2021. Purchase price, $2.4 million. Derek claimed he'd bought the property in early 2020. The dates didn't match. Rachel pulled up the LLC registration records. Cascade Holdings had been incorporated in Oregon in 2019. The registered agent was listed as James Reynolds, a name that rang bells, though she couldn't place why. Her phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Coffee later? Want to run some business ideas past you? She stared at the message, then back at her screen. Her brother was walking toward a cliff, and she was the only one who could see the edge. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Webb arrived early at the construction site of their current project. The morning fog clung to the scaffolding as he reviewed Derek's latest expansion proposal. 27 years in construction had taught him to read between the lines of financial projections. The numbers didn't add up. Derek's business model assumed he could leverage the Victorian for $8 million in expansion capital. But Marcus had been asking around. Word in the contractor community was that Derek's ownership situation was complicated. When Derek arrived an hour later, Marcus was ready. We need to talk, Marcus said, setting down his coffee. About the Victorian. About your actual equity position. Derek's smile faltered. What do you mean? I mean, I've been in this business long enough to spot problems before they become disasters. And right now, you feel like a man building castles on someone else's land. That's ridiculous. I own that property. Marcus pulled out a folder. Then explain this. He handed Derek a printout of property tax records showing Cascade Holdings as the current owner. Derek stared at the document, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing panic. This has to be a mistake. Some kind of clerical error with the property management company. Derek, listen to me carefully. I lost everything once because I didn't verify what I thought I knew. If you don't actually own that property, I own it. Derek interrupted, but his voice carried no conviction. I have to own it. I've put everything into it. The desperation in Derek's voice told Marcus everything he needed to know. His partner was operating on faith rather than facts, and faith didn't secure construction loans. That afternoon, Elena Vasquez sat in her office, staring at the phone and dreading the conversation she knew was coming. Max had been clear. Stall any applications Derek submitted. But Derek had been calling every hour, demanding status updates on his equity loan paperwork. Her assistant knocked on the door. Elena? Derek Morrison is here. He seems upset. Derek entered her office like a man possessed, his usual charm replaced by barely controlled panic. Elena? I need answers. Now. The property records are showing some company called Cascade Holdings as the owner of my house. Elena felt her chest tighten. Derek, maybe you should sit down. I don't want to sit down. I want to know why county records are showing someone else owns my property. The moment Elena had been dreading for 3 years had finally arrived. She could continue the deception, help Derek commit fraud, and risk her professional license. Or she could tell the truth and watch his world collapse. Derek, she said quietly, there's something you need to know about Cascade Holdings. What about it? Elena took a deep breath. It's Max's company. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Derek stared at her, his face cycling through disbelief, confusion, and dawning horror. That's impossible. Max doesn't have that kind of money. She works in tech support or something. Derek, Max Reynolds built and sold a software company for $47 million in 2019. She owns half a dozen properties through Cascade Holdings. The Victorian mansion is just one of them. Derek sank into the chair he'd refused moments earlier, his face draining of color. You're telling me that for 3 years I've been renovating my girlfriend's house? That everything I've built, everything I've achieved, belongs to her, Elena finished quietly. I'm sorry, Derek. I wanted to tell you, but client confidentiality. Client confidentiality? Derek's voice rose to a shout. I've been living a lie for 3 years? And you're talking about client confidentiality? Elena remained calm, though her heart was racing. Derek, you need to understand the position you're in. The applications you've submitted for equity loans, the representations you've made to investors about ownership. If those go forward, you could be charged with fraud. The word hit Derek like a physical blow. Fraud. Criminal charges. Everything he'd built, everything he'd claimed to achieve, was built on a foundation that belonged to someone else. She knew, he whispered. All this time she knew. And she let me make a fool of myself. Derek. She sat there while I bragged about my success, while I called her old and useless, while I lectured her about achievement. And she knew. His voice gained strength, as anger replaced shock. She fucking knew. Elena watched Derek's face transform as the full scope of his situation became clear. The humiliation, the financial exposure, the complete destruction of his self-image. It was all hitting him at once. What do I do? He asked, his voice hollow. Elena had been dreading this question, almost as much as the revelation itself. You need to call Max. You need to have an honest conversation about where you stand. And Derek? She paused, choosing her words carefully. You need to do it before anyone else finds out. Because if this becomes public knowledge... Derek nodded slowly, understanding the implications. His reputation, his business relationships, his future in the industry, everything depended on how the next few hours played out. He stood to leave, then turned back to Elena. How long have you known? Since the beginning, she admitted. I handled the original purchase for Cascade Holdings. Derek stared at her for a long moment, then walked out of her office and into the uncertain territory of his completely reconstructed reality. Rachel Morrison had spent the day researching James Reynolds and finally made the connection. Derek's girlfriend Max worked for a tech company managed by James Reynolds, her brother, the same James Reynolds who was the registered agent for Cascade Holdings. The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that made Rachel sick to her stomach. Her brother wasn't just mistaken about his property ownership. He was the victim of an elaborate deception by someone who'd been watching him build his dreams on her foundation. Her phone rang. Derek's number. Rach, I need to see you. Tonight. It's urgent. Derek, what's wrong? You sound terrible. Everything, he said, his voice hollow. Everything is wrong. Max stood in her downtown office, staring out at the Portland skyline while Sophie's voice echoed through the speakerphone. The conversation with Elena had confirmed what Max already knew. Derek was about to discover the truth, and there would be no controlling how that revelation unfolded. You have to call him, Sophie was saying. Before he hears it from someone else, before this gets any more complicated. Max, are you listening to me? I'm listening. Max's voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. Elena said he looked devastated, completely broken. Good. Maybe now you'll both start being honest with each other. Max turned away from the window. It's too late for that, Sophie. The damage is done. I let him dig himself so deep into this lie that the truth is going to destroy him. The truth should have been told 3 years ago, Sophie replied sharply. You created this situation, Max. You chose deception over trust, and now you're both going to pay the price. Max ended the call and sat down at her desk, staring at her phone. Derek would be calling soon. She could feel it. The carefully constructed world they'd built together was about to collapse, and she wasn't sure either of them would survive the rubble. Her phone buzzed. A text from Derek. We need to talk. Tonight. Don't make me come find you. The barely controlled anger in those words made Max's chest tighten. She'd seen Derek frustrated, disappointed, even hurt. But she'd never seen him truly angry, and she realized with growing unease that she had no idea how he would handle this level of betrayal. Across town, Derek sat in his truck outside Rachel's apartment building, trying to find the words to explain a situation he barely understood himself. His sister had been right to ask questions, right to push for documentation. She'd seen what he'd been too proud to examine. Rachel appeared at his passenger door, her face tight with concern. "Derek, you're scaring me. What's going on?" "Get in," he said quietly. "We need to drive." As they pulled away from the curb, Derek began talking. He told her about Elena's revelation, about Cascade Holdings, about the property records that had shattered his understanding of the last 3 years. Rachel listened without interruption, her lawyer's mind cataloging the legal implications while her heart broke for her brother. "She knew," Derek said finally. "The whole time she knew I was living in her house, spending my money to improve her investment, bragging about achieving something that was never mine. And she just watched." "Derek," Rachel said carefully, "what are you planning to do?" "I don't know." His voice was hollow. "Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my success, about my relationship, it's all been a lie. How do you come back from something like that?" Rachel studied her brother's profile, seeing pain she hadn't witnessed since their father's business failed. But there was something else there too, a cold anger that worried her more than his devastation. "You need to be careful about how you handle this," she said. "Whatever you're feeling right now, whatever you want to say to Max, you need to think about the consequences. For your business, for your future, for your legal exposure." Derek's laugh was bitter. "Legal exposure? Rachel, I don't have a business. I have a lie that's about to be exposed to every investor, every client, every person in this industry who believed in me. My legal exposure is the least of my problems." "No, it's not." Rachel's voice turned sharp. "Derek, if you've represented yourself as the owner of that property to secure loans or investments, that's fraud. If this becomes public, if people start asking questions about your financial representations, then I'm fucked," Derek finished. "Is that what you're trying to tell me?" "I'm trying to tell you that your next conversation with Max might be the most important conversation of your life. And you need to have it with a clear head, not with whatever's driving you right now." Derek pulled into the parking lot of the Victorian mansion, Max's Victorian mansion, and sat staring at the house he'd thought represented his greatest achievement. Every improvement he'd made, every detail he'd perfected, every moment of pride he'd felt about the restoration, all of it had been an illusion. "She's probably in there right now," he said quietly, "waiting for me to come home so she can pretend to be supportive while knowing that everything I am is built on her foundation." Rachel reached for her brother's arm. "Derek, promise me you won't do anything you can't take back. Promise me you'll remember that whatever happens next, you still have choices about who you want to be." Derek looked at his sister, seeing the fear in her eyes. He wanted to promise her that he'd handle this with dignity, that he'd find a way to salvage something from the wreckage of his self-deception. But the anger burning in his chest felt too hot for promises. "I need to go face this," he said finally. Rachel watched him walk toward the front door of the house that had never been his, and felt a chill of premonition about what was going to happen when Derek finally confronted the woman who'd been watching him live a lie for 3 years. Inside the Victorian, Max heard Derek's truck in the driveway and felt her stomach clench with anxiety. She'd been rehearsing this conversation for hours, trying to find words that might bridge the gap between deception and truth, between the pain she'd caused and the love she still felt. But as Derek's key turned in the lock to her house, she reminded herself. Max realized that no amount of preparation could make this moment anything other than a reckoning that would change both of their lives forever. The door opened, and Derek stepped inside. The man who entered wasn't the confident, ambitious boyfriend she'd been living with for 3 years. This was someone she'd never seen before. Someone whose entire sense of self had been stripped away, leaving only raw pain and barely controlled fury. "Hello, Max," he said quietly. his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "I think it's time we had that honest conversation about what I've actually achieved." Max stood in the living room she'd designed, surrounded by the renovations she'd funded, facing the man she'd deceived, and realized that the game she'd been playing was about to have consequences she'd never fully imagined. The reckoning had finally arrived. The Victorian mansion's living room had never felt more like a stage set than it did in the moments before Derek spoke. Max stood near the fireplace, her hands clasped behind her back, while Derek remained by the front door as if he might need to escape quickly. 3 years, Derek said finally, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made Max's skin crawl. 3 years of you watching me make a fool of myself. Derek, let me explain. Explain? Derek's laugh was hollow. Explain how you bought this house 6 months before we met? Explain how you've been sitting there every night while I talked about my vision, my investment, my achievement. Explain how you let me call you old and useless while you owned the ground I was standing on? Max felt each word like a physical blow. Hearing her deception laid out in Derek's broken voice made the magnitude of her betrayal impossible to deny. I wanted to tell you. So many times I almost... But you didn't. Derek stepped further into the room, his eyes taking in details that suddenly looked different. You didn't tell me when we moved in together. You didn't tell me when I spent $60,000 on kitchen renovations. You didn't tell me when I started using this property as collateral for business loans. The last words hit Max like ice water. Derek, please tell me you didn't actually submit those loan applications. Oh, now you're concerned about my financial decisions? Derek's voice rose. Now you want to protect me from making mistakes? Where was that concern when I was applying for second mortgages on property I don't own? Max felt the blood drain from her face. Did you sign anything? Did you submit documentation claiming ownership? Why does that matter to you, Max? Are you worried about your investment? Concerned that your boyfriend might have accidentally committed fraud while living in your little experiment? The word experiment hung in the air between them like a live grenade. Max realized that Derek wasn't just hurt. He believed their entire relationship had been a calculated manipulation. It wasn't an experiment, Max said quietly. Derek, I know this looks terrible, but you have to believe that my feelings for you are real. That everything between us is built on a lie. Derek's voice broke slightly. You want to know what the worst part is? It's not the money. It's not even the humiliation. It's that you sat there while I told you about my dreams, my plans for the future, my insecurities about success. And you knew I was building castles in the air, and you let me keep building. Max tried to find words that might bridge the gap between them, but Derek wasn't finished. Do you remember what I said about older women? About you being threatened by my success? Derek's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. You must have found that particularly amusing. Poor Derek, lecturing the millionaire about achievement. I never found it amusing, Max said, her own anger finally breaking through. I found it hurtful. I found it small and petty and cruel. You want to know why I didn't tell you? Because of moments exactly like that. Because every time you felt threatened, you'd diminish me. You'd make me smaller to make yourself feel bigger. So this was punishment? Derek's voice was dangerously quiet. This whole thing was you teaching me a lesson about respect? Max felt the conversation spiraling beyond any possibility of reconciliation. It started as protection. I've been burned before by men who wanted my money more than they wanted me. I thought if you could love me without knowing about my wealth, then what, Max? Then you'd reveal yourself as my financial savior? Then you'd swoop in and rescue me from my own ambitions? I don't know, Max admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I honestly don't know what I thought would happen. Derek stared at her for a long moment, and Max saw something die in his eyes. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 3 years. The sound of a car door slamming outside made them both turn toward the window. Marcus Webb was walking up the front path, his expression grim. Expecting company? Derek asked, his tone bitter. Before Max could answer, Marcus knocked on the front door. Derek opened it to find his business partner standing on the porch with Elena Vasquez beside him. We need to talk, Marcus said, looking between Derek and Max. All of us. About what happens next. Elena stepped forward, her professional composure barely masking her anxiety. Derek, have you submitted any loan applications using this property as collateral? Why does everyone keep asking me that? Derek snapped. Because, Marcus said heavily, Patricia Hamlin called me an hour ago. She's pulling out of the investment group. Apparently, someone raised questions about your property ownership, and she's concerned about due diligence issues. Max felt her stomach drop. The seeds of doubt she'd planted with Patricia were growing faster than she'd anticipated. She's also talking to the other investors, Elena added quietly. Derek, if word gets out that you've been misrepresenting your financial position, then I'm finished, Derek said flatly. Is that what you're trying to tell me? Marcus nodded slowly. The construction industry is small, Derek. Reputation is everything. If people start questioning your integrity, your business relationships, then I lose everything. Derek looked around the room, at the house he'd thought was his, at the woman who'd deceived him, at the business partner trying to salvage what could be saved. Well, at least now I know where I actually stand. Max stepped forward, desperate to find some way to repair the damage. Derek, I can fix this. I can transfer ownership, make you a partner, whatever you need. You think this is about ownership? Derek's voice cut through her words like a blade. You think you can write a check and make this go away? Max, you didn't just lie about property. You lied about who you are. You lied about who I am. You let me build my entire identity around something that was never real. The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of absolute finality. Max realized that she'd been so focused on the financial implications of her deception that she'd missed the deeper wound. Derek's sense of self had been shattered, and no amount of money could rebuild that. So what happens now? Elena asked quietly. Derek looked around the room one more time, his gaze lingering on details he'd thought represented his vision and achievement. Now I figure out who I actually am when I'm not living someone else's dream. He walked toward the front door, then turned back to Max. I'll be out by the end of the week. I assume you'll want to change the locks. Derek, please. Please what, Max? Please pretend this never happened. Please go back to the way things were. Derek shook his head. We can't go back. There is no back. There's only figuring out how to live with what we've done to each other. He walked out of the house, Max's house, leaving her standing in the wreckage of the relationship she'd destroyed through her own careful deceptions. The truth had finally been revealed, but Max was beginning to understand that some revelations came too late to save anything worth preserving. 3 days after the revelation, Derek sat in his sister's guest bedroom, staring at legal documents that Elena had prepared. The papers formally released him from any fraudulent claims regarding the Victorian property, but they couldn't release him from the humiliation that followed him like a shadow. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from clients, investors, and contractors who'd heard whispers about his situation. Word traveled fast in Portland's construction community, and Derek's reputation was unraveling faster than he could contain it. Marcus called, Rachel said from the doorway. The Riverside project is being put on hold. The client wants to review all contracts before proceeding. Derek nodded without surprise. How many does that make? 4 this week. Rachel's voice was gentle. Derek, maybe it's time to consider bankruptcy protection. Start fresh. Start fresh is what? Derek's laugh was hollow. A 40-year-old failed contractor with a history of financial misrepresentation? Who's going to hire me, Rachel? Who's going to trust me? Meanwhile, Max sat in her Pearl District office, mechanically reviewing financial reports, while her world felt suspended in amber. Jimmy had been managing the crisis with characteristic efficiency, damage control with investors, legal protection for Cascade Holdings, media strategies to minimize exposure. The Morrison renovations contracts have been terminated, Jimmy reported. We'll need to find new contractors to finish the remaining work on the Victorian. Max looked up from papers she hadn't actually been reading. He did beautiful work. Max, I'm not being sentimental. I'm stating a fact. Derek's craftsmanship was exceptional. The restoration is museum quality. Jimmy studied his sister's face. Are you having second thoughts about how you handled this? Max considered the question. 3 days ago, she'd been consumed with righteous anger about Derek's dismissive comments. Now, watching the systematic destruction of his career, she felt only hollow emptiness. I'm having thoughts about who I've become, she said quietly. Sophie arrived that evening, armed with Chinese takeout and unwavering directness. You look terrible. Thank you. That's exactly what I needed to hear. Max, you need to decide what you want to accomplish here. Do you want Derek destroyed, or do you want to find a way forward? I don't know. Max picked at her food without appetite. I spent 3 years being angry about being deceived in my last relationship. Turns out I'm perfectly capable of deception myself. The difference is intent, Sophie said. Richard was malicious. You were misguided. Tell that to Derek. Tell that to his business partners, who trusted him based on representations he couldn't fulfill. Sophie set down her chopsticks. Max, I've seen a lot of relationships end badly. The ones that leave permanent damage are the ones where people choose cruelty over closure. You still have choices about how this ends. Across town, Derek was making his own choices. Marcus had offered to buy out Derek's equipment and remaining contracts, providing enough money to avoid bankruptcy, but not enough to restart elsewhere. I need to ask you something, Derek said to Marcus in the Morrison Renovations office they were dismantling. Did you know about Max, about the property? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. I suspected something wasn't right. The numbers never quite added up. But I didn't know specifics. Why didn't you push harder for answers? Because I wanted to believe in what we were building. Sometimes you don't ask questions because you're afraid of the answers. Derek nodded, understanding the sentiment completely. His entire relationship with Max had been built on not asking questions he was afraid to have answered. What will you do now? Marcus asked. Derek looked around the office, cataloging 3 years of dreams that were ending. I don't know. Start over somewhere else, maybe. Find work with someone who doesn't know my story. Derek, Marcus said carefully, for what it's worth, your work was exceptional. The craftsmanship, the vision, the attention to detail, that was all real. That was all yours. Derek felt something loosen in his chest, the first moment of peace he'd experienced since Elena's revelation. The work had been real. Whatever else was illusion, his actual skills, his genuine love for restoration, his eye for authentic detail, those things belonged to him. It wasn't much to build on, but it was something. The Victorian mansion sat empty for the first time in 3 years, its perfectly restored rooms waiting for someone to decide what came next. The house that had been the center of so much deception, ambition, and heartbreak remained beautiful, unchanged by the human drama that had played out within its walls. But for the people who'd loved and betrayed each other there, everything had changed, and there was no going back to the comfortable lies they'd told themselves about who they were and what they meant to each other. 2 weeks later, Max stood in the Victorians' empty living room, her footsteps echoing in the space Derek had once filled with his plans and dreams. The house felt like a mausoleum of their relationship, beautiful, expensive, and completely lifeless. Rachel Morrison knocked on the front door, her arrival both expected and dreaded. Max had requested this meeting through Elena, knowing that any hope of resolution had to go through Derek's sister. Thank you for coming, Max said, opening the door. Rachel stepped inside, her lawyer's eyes automatically cataloging the space. It's beautiful. I can see why Derek fell in love with it. Can I offer you coffee? Tea? Just answers, Rachel said, settling into the living room. Derek's considering leaving Portland. Starting over somewhere, his reputation isn't destroyed. I thought you should know. Max felt something twist in her chest. Where would he go? Seattle? Maybe. San Francisco. Somewhere he can rebuild without his past following him. Rachel studied Max's face. Is that what you wanted? To drive him away completely? The question hit harder than Max had expected. I wanted him to understand how it felt to be dismissed. I wanted him to recognize my value. Mission accomplished, Rachel said dryly. Derek understands exactly how much power you had over his life. He also understands that the woman he loved never actually existed. Max flinched. That's not true. My feelings for Derek were real. But everything else was performance, wasn't it? The supportive girlfriend act, the modest lifestyle, the careful way you let him explain things you already knew better than he did. The words stung because they were accurate. Max had been performing a version of herself, playing a role she thought Derek needed rather than being the person she actually was. I was protecting myself, Max said quietly. From what? From being loved for who you really are? From being respected for your actual achievements? Rachel leaned forward. Max, Derek's not blameless here. His comments about age and success were inexcusable, but you never gave him the chance to love the real you. You created a test he couldn't pass because he didn't know he was being tested. Max stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Derek had restored with such care. What does he want from me? Nothing, Rachel said simply. That's what you need to understand. Derek doesn't want your money, your property, or your pity. He wants to rebuild his life without the constant reminder of how thoroughly he was deceived. And if I wanted to help, if I wanted to find a way to repair some of the damage, Rachel was quiet for a long moment. There might be a way, but it would require you to give up the one thing you've been holding on to. What's that? Control. The conversation continued for another hour, with Rachel outlining a possibility that had never occurred to Max. A way to help Derek rebuild without making him dependent on her charity. A path forward that acknowledged the damage done while creating space for something like healing. It would require Max to step back, to let Derek find his own way without her influence or interference. It would mean accepting that some wounds couldn't be healed, only honored by doing better going forward. That evening, Max called Jimmy to her office. I want to do something, and I need your help to do it right, she said. Jimmy listened as Max outlined her plan, his expression shifting from skepticism to understanding to something approaching admiration. It's risky, he said finally, and expensive. And there's no guarantee Derek will accept it. I know. You also know that once you do this, there's no going back. No way to control how he uses it or whether he'll ever forgive you. Max nodded. I've controlled enough. It's time to let Derek write his own story. Meanwhile, Derek was in Marcus's workshop, helping dismantle equipment they'd shared for 3 years. The physical work felt good, giving him something concrete to focus on while his future remained uncertain. I got a call today, Marcus said, setting down a circular saw. From a developer in Seattle. High-end restoration work, similar to what we were doing here. They're looking for experienced craftsmen. Derek looked up. You interested? Me? No. But they might be interested in you. If you want, I could make some calls. The offer represented escape, a chance to start over in a city where nobody knew his story. But it also meant leaving behind everything familiar, running away instead of rebuilding. I'll think about it, Derek said. That night, Derek sat in Rachel's apartment, staring at his laptop screen. The Seattle developer's website showed beautiful restoration projects, the kind of work he'd dreamed of doing. But looking at the images felt like looking at someone else's future. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know we can't fix what's broken, but maybe we can build something better from the pieces. If you're willing to listen, I have a proposal, Max. Derek stared at the message, feeling a familiar mix of anger and curiosity. Max still thought she could solve everything, still believed the right offer could repair the damage she'd caused. But despite everything, despite the hurt and humiliation and destroyed trust, Derek found himself wondering what she had in mind. Maybe it was masochism. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the recognition that running away wouldn't change the fundamental questions about who he was and what he really wanted from his life. He typed back, "One conversation, that's all." Because sometimes the only way forward was through the very thing that had broken you. 6 months later, Derek Morrison stood in the workshop of Morrison & Associates Restoration, a company that existed because of Max's proposal and succeeded because of Derek's refusal to accept charity disguised as partnership. The deal Max had offered was simple: She would provide initial funding for Derek to start his own restoration company, with no ownership stake, no control, and no expectation of involvement. The money was a loan at market rates, with Derek's skills and reputation as the only collateral required. "It's not an apology," Max had said during their careful negotiation. "It's an acknowledgement that your abilities were never dependent on my property or my money. You're a master craftsman, Derek. That was always yours." Derek had spent 3 weeks considering the offer, consulting with lawyers, and wrestling with his pride. Taking money from Max felt like accepting defeat. But walking away from his passion because of wounded ego felt like a different kind of defeat. Rachel had been characteristically direct. "The question isn't whether you can trust Max. The question is whether you can trust yourself to build something that's genuinely yours." Now, looking around the workshop filled with authentic period fixtures and original architectural elements, Derek knew he'd made the right choice. The business was growing, driven by Derek's reputation for meticulous craftsmanship and his ability to honor historical integrity while incorporating modern functionality. Marcus had joined him 6 weeks earlier, bringing decades of experience and a client base that trusted his judgment. Together, they were building something that felt solid, something that belonged to them regardless of how it had begun. "The Hawthorne project is ready for final inspection," Marcus reported, reviewing their schedule. "Client wants to discuss expanding to include the carriage house." Derek nodded, making notes in his project log. The Hawthorne house was their largest commission yet, a complete restoration of an 1880s Queen Anne that would establish their reputation in Portland's preservation community. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Saw the article in Portland Monthly about the Hawthorne restoration. Beautiful work. -M." Derek stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it without responding. Max occasionally reached out with brief, professional acknowledgments of his work. He appreciated that she kept her distance while still recognizing his achievements. Their relationship was over, permanently and completely. But the business relationship had evolved into something that worked, because it acknowledged both the damage done and the value that remained. That afternoon, Derek received a call from Elena Vasquez. "I have clients looking for a complete Victorian restoration," she said. "High-end budget, historically significant property, demanding timeline. Interested? Tell me about the property." Derek listened as Elena described the project, taking notes on specifications and timeline requirements. It sounded like exactly the kind of work he'd dreamed of doing: complex, prestigious, and technically challenging. "There's one thing I should mention," Elena said carefully. "The property is owned by Cascade Holdings." Derek felt his chest tighten. "Max's company." "Yes, but Derek, this isn't about your history with Max. This is a legitimate business opportunity. The property needs work. You're the best restoration contractor in Portland, and the job pays well." Derek was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Working on Max's property would be complicated, fraught with emotional landmines and professional challenges. But it would also be an opportunity to prove something important: that his skills existed independently of their personal history, that he could work with Max's company professionally without being defined by their failed relationship. "Send me the specs," Derek said finally. "I'll review the project and provide a bid." Derek. Professional bid, professional relationship, professional work. Nothing more, nothing less. 2 weeks later, Derek walked through the 1895 Colonial that would be his next project. The house needed extensive work: foundation repair, electrical updating, complete interior restoration. It was exactly the kind of project that excited him most. Max wasn't there for the initial inspection, which Derek appreciated. This needed to be about the work, not about their complicated history. But as he measured rooms and assessed structural needs, Derek found himself thinking about the conversation that had started everything. Max's questions about his foundation, her challenges about what he actually owned versus what he'd achieved. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was building a new foundation now, one that belonged to him completely. It was harder work than renovating someone else's property, but it was work that would last because it was built on truth rather than illusion. His phone rang. Rachel's number. "How's the new project?" she asked. "Complicated. But good complicated. The kind where you know the work matters." "And working with Max's company?" Derek looked around the empty house, imagining what it could become with proper restoration. "It's work, Rachel. Good work. And I'm good at my work." "Yes, you are," Rachel agreed. "Dad would be proud." Derek felt something settle in his chest at his sister's words. Their father had lost everything once, but he'd taught both his children that failure wasn't permanent unless you let it define you. "I think he would be too," Derek said. As Derek finished his inspection and prepared his bid, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. He'd lost a relationship, a business partnership, and an understanding of himself that had taken years to build. But he'd gained something too. The knowledge that his real achievements couldn't be taken away by deception or destroyed by betrayal. His skills, his passion, his commitment to excellence, those things belonged to him regardless of who owned the property he worked on. The Victorian mansion that had been the center of so much drama sat empty, its perfect restoration, a monument to both Derek's abilities and the relationship that had ended there. Max had put it on the market, unable to live with the memories it contained. But Derek had moved on to new projects, new challenges, new opportunities, to build something lasting and true. The foundation he was creating now was built on honesty, hard work, and the recognition that real success couldn't be borrowed or stolen. It had to be earned, day by day, project by project, choice by choice. It wasn't the future either Derek or Max had imagined when they first met, but it was a future they could both live with, built on the understanding that some lessons could only be learned through losing everything you thought you wanted and discovering what you actually needed. The house that pride built had fallen, but from its ruins, both Derek and Max were learning to build something better. Lives based on truth rather than illusion, achievement rather than appearance, and the recognition that real love, whether romantic or professional, could only exist between people brave enough to be genuinely known. It was a harder foundation to build, but it was one that would last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.